You wake up to the sound of footsteps, not hurried, not playful, but measured. The air is thick, not just with the scent of soot and coal, but with something heavier, fear. It lingers in the hallways, presses against the walls, and nests in every small heartbeat. Outside the nursery door, the tick of the clock echoes like a drum, calling attention to every movement, every whisper, every misstep. You pull the blankets tighter around your shoulders, hoping the chill will hide you, hoping the governess won't notice. But a cough escapes anyway, sharp and human. And suddenly, the rules descend. The belt, the rod, the lecturing gaze, all poised, all waiting. It's Victorian England, a world that measures love not by warmth, but by endurance, where affection is a danger, silence a virtue, and obedience the highest form of morality. Children are taught that every tear is weakness, every question a sin. Mothers are trained to stand still, fathers to command without mercy, and nurses to deliver care only as the manuals permit. Some say it's discipline, some say it's protection. But behind every lesson lies something darker, the quiet erosion of childhood, the shaping of small hearts into shadows of compliance, the replacement of instinct with fear. This isn't just history. This is what it felt like to grow up when every embrace could be forbidden, every word measured, and every mistake punished. When the world itself became a teacher of cruelty disguised as care. Welcome to why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. And tonight, you're not just hearing the story, you're living it. The first sound in a Victorian household is never laughter. It is the thin, uncertain cry of a newborn, swallowed by heavy drapes and the hiss of a gas lamp. Somewhere below, the household continues, its rituals, boots polished, fires stoked, silver arranged for breakfast, while upstairs, in a room smelling faintly of blood and lavender, a woman lies motionless beneath starched sheets. The midwife whispers that it's done. The wet nurse is already waiting, and the father, standing stiffly near the hearth, refuses to look at the small, red bundle now wailing in the nurse's arms. It is not his place to touch the child, not yet. The curtains stay drawn. Privacy is virtue. Emotion is not. The room feels less like a birth chamber and more like a confession booth, full of guilt, discipline, and quiet duty. The nurse presses the baby's lips to a bottle of milk, prepared hours earlier. A measured formula of cow's cream and sugar water, mixed cold, prescribed by a doctor who insists that warmth breeds weakness. She hums a lullaby without melody, only rhythm. The mother turns her head away. It isn't proper to watch. Outside, the carriages rattle by, horses snorting steam into the fog. The city is awakening to another day of industry and piety. The Victorian household exists as a small kingdom ruled by appearances, where a child is born not to be cherished but to fulfill a function. Heir, daughter, asset, lesson. Even before the first breath is taken, love has been replaced by expectation, and the sound of that first cry, sharp and desperate, is already seen as a test of fortitude, not a plea for comfort. The wet nurse wraps the baby in flannel, tucks it into a cradle carved from oak, and sets it near the wall farthest from the mother's bed. The nurse knows better than to linger. She will feed it at the appointed hour, no sooner, no later, for the manuals written by men have decreed that infants must not rule their keepers. To respond too quickly to a cry is to spoil the soul. To soothe too often is to weaken the will. The mother listens to her child from behind her veil of pain and propriety. She has been told that her work is finished, that her duty is done. Her body has performed its role. Her emotions must now be dismissed. Even the act of naming will be deferred until the father consults the family Bible. The nurse whispers again, "Rest, madam." But rest does not come easily in a house where even tenderness is scheduled. Hours later, as night falls again, the midwife extinguishes the last lamp and closes the door. The baby stirs. Its soft cry seeps through the curtains, down the staircase, and into the hall where portraits of ancestors hang in their stiff authority. No one answers. The household sleeps, confident that the child's lungs will strengthen from the exercise of solitude. And so, the first lesson of Victorian childhood begins not in comfort, but in control. The cry behind the curtains is not merely a sound, it is a boundary being built, one sigh at a time. A generation will grow up learning that silence is safer than need, that love is best hidden beneath lace, and that the heart, once restrained, makes for a more presentable air. In the morning, the nurse will open the curtains. The air will be cold and grey. The baby's tears will have dried against its cheek, and the household will resume polished, punctual, proper, as if nothing sacred had ever happened here at all. The morning light creeps softly across the wallpaper, pale gold fading into grey. The mother wakes not to the sound of her child, but to the hush of footsteps outside her door. The nurse has already taken the infant to the nursery upstairs. That separation, she's been told, is for the good of everyone. A woman's role is to recover, to smile, to appear composed when her husband comes to inspect the outcome of her labor. Emotion is a private indulgence, one that good mothers learn to hide. Her wrists ache where she gripped the bed frame during birth. Her chest feels hollow, not from pain but from absence, the kind that begins when your child's first breath is taken in another's arms. A maid opens the window, lets in the thin smell of coal smoke, and draws back the curtains. The doctor has written in his notes that the patient is nervous but compliant. He prescribes rest, tonics, and a strict avoidance of excitement. Excitement, in this house, means love. By noon, drawing room fills with polite visitors, sisters, neighbors, the vicar's wife, all eager to see the child but forbidden to touch. They praise the mother's restraint, her calm, her ability to endure childbirth without display. It is the highest compliment a Victorian woman can receive. She suffered invisibly. When they leave, the house settles back into its rhythm, clocks ticking, fires murmuring, and somewhere above, a muffled cry that goes unanswered. She listens. Every sound from the nursery is both comfort and wound, but she dares not rise. The doctor's orders are law, and besides, the house runs on rules stronger than medicine. Mothers who nurse their own children are whispered about as sentimental, even vulgar. It ruins the figure, the matrons say. It confuses the child's loyalties. So she stays in bed while another woman rocks her infant, hums lullabies, and becomes quietly, secretly, the child's first memory of affection. Evenings, her husband visits. He speaks of business, of dinner guests, of the Queen's latest decree. He never mentions the baby. It is the nurse's domain now. When he finally asks how she feels, she answers as she must. Better every day. He nods, satisfied, and leaves her in the half-light, where her thoughts become dangerous things. What would happen, she wonders, if she broke the rule and went upstairs, if she held her child without permission? But there is a sound to obedience, a weight to silence that settles over her like dust. She lies still and listens to the house, breathe the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the curtains, the faint lullaby filtering through the ceiling. The melody is meant for the baby, yet it seems to cradle her instead. Down the hall, the nurse hums. The child's crying fades, and somewhere between them, the mother's heart folds in on itself, learning its first Victorian lesson. Love, too, must be endured in quiet. Tomorrow she will sit by the window, embroidery in hand, smiling when the visitors return. They will praise her grace, her composure, her perfect restraint. No one will know that in the stillness between stitches, she is listening for a cry she is never meant to answer. By the time the child learns to crawl, affection has already been trained out of the household. The nurse keeps her distance, as the manuals demand. When the boy cries after falling, she does not pick him up. She straightens his clothes and tells him softly, "A gentleman does not weep." The phrase will echo in his memory long after he forgets the reason he cried. Downstairs, his father eats breakfast with the precision of a man who measures worth in order and silence. He reads the Times aloud, quoting the latest treatise on raising strong English sons. Children, the column declares, must learn early to master their tempers and their tears. He folds the paper neatly, satisfied. His own father raised him the same way, without softness, without explanation, without the weakness of love made visible. He sees no reason to change what forged him. When the boy is brought into the room, he stands beside the chair and bows. Speak clearly, the father instructs, and do not fidget. The child's small hands tremble, hidden behind his back. The conversation lasts 3 minutes. The father nods approval, then dismisses him with a single word, "Go." That brief audience is counted a success, for in this house, a child's worth is measured by how little space he occupies. Upstairs, the mother watches from the landing, her fingers tightening on the rail. She has grown practiced at stillness, at pretending not to notice the quiet cruelties that pass for training. Every instinct tells her to intervene, yet every sermon, every etiquette book, every whisper from society insists otherwise. A woman who questions her husband's authority risks being labeled hysterical, and hysteria is treated like everything else in this age, with isolation. The father believes hardship builds character, so the child's bed is stripped of blankets each morning to teach resilience. Cold baths greet him at dawn, and scolding replaces comfort. He is told that hunger before supper sharpens the mind. When he flinches at thunder, the father calls it imagination and forbids him from showing fear. By the time the boy turns 5, he has learned to cry silently into the pillow, burying each sob like a secret crime. At night, when the household sleeps, the mother tiptoes into the nursery. She brushes a curl from her son's forehead and whispers the words she cannot say by daylight. "You are safe," she breathes. The phrase feels foreign, as if the language itself has forgotten tenderness. The child stirs but does not wake. She lingers only a moment, listening for the creak of the floorboard that means discovery. Then she leaves as quietly as she came, her heart thudding like contraband against her ribs. Downstairs, the grandfather clock tolls midnight. The house exhales its familiar silence, heavy, respectable, absolute. Somewhere beyond the window, rain taps softly on the glass. Inside, a boy sleeps in the chill of his training, dreaming of warmth he has never been allowed to feel. By morning, the lessons will begin again. He will rise at the sound of the bell, wash in water cold as steel, and thank his father for the privilege of becoming hard. At the very top of the house, above the scent of polished mahogany and the voices of dinner guests, lies the nursery, a kingdom built on rules and restraint. The staircase that leads to it is narrow and steep, lined with portraits of solemn children who never smile. It is said that laughter doesn't belong on the upper floor. It disturbs the peace of the house below. The door opens with a sigh of hinges, revealing a world both miniature and immense. The walls are papered with faded animals, lambs, foxes, and birds mid-flight, their colors dulled by years of coal smoke rising from the floors beneath. A single window filters gray daylight through lace so thick it mutes the sun. The air smells faintly of starch and camphor, clean but lifeless. This is where children are sent to be seen less, heard not at all, and molded quietly into what the world expects of them. 2 nursemaids move about like ghosts of efficiency. They speak in whispers, rarely addressing the children by name, Miss, Master, Little One. Their affection is measured, careful. A misplaced word or unguarded tenderness might cost them their position. They have their own kind of love, hidden, cautious, expressed in the smallest rebellions. A second spoonful of sugar in the porridge, a blanket left unwashed so it still smells of the mother's perfume. The nursery runs on a strict timetable. Meals at 8 and 2, recitation at 3, punishment at 4, prayers at 6. The children rise, eat, sit, and sleep by the clock's command. Between these hours, they are trained to be still. Stillness is a virtue here, the first step toward gentility. Restless fingers are tied with ribbons. Chatter is silenced with a look. The youngest learn early that good behavior means invisibility. In the corner stands the nanny's chair, a throne of quiet authority, upholstered in dark green velvet. From it, she oversees every movement, the brushing of hair, the folding of hands, precise bowing of heads during lessons. Her patience is legendary, her punishment swift. The children fear her slippers more than the rod itself. And yet, at night, when fevers come or dreams turn frightening, it is her lap they seek, trembling and small. She rocks them back to sleep, her eyes wet but her voice composed. Tomorrow she will pretend it never happened. Downstairs, the parents dine with guests. They speak of their offspring with polite pride, referring to them as if they were investments. Our boy is strong. Our girl shows promise. They do not mention tears or longing. The nursery is another world, a floor removed not just by distance but by expectation. When the house finally goes dark, the last candle flickers in the nursery window. The nanny checks each bed, straightens each sheet, and whispers a prayer too soft to be heard. The children sleep beneath ceilings cracked by time, dreaming of running through fields they've never seen. In the stillness, one thing becomes clear: childhood. Here is not a season of play. It is preparation for a life already chosen, rehearsed in silence beneath the nursery's fading wallpaper. In the nursery, the rhythm of the day is set not by hunger, nor sleep, nor the rise and fall of sunlight, but by the clock mounted high upon the wall. Its pendulum swings like a quiet metronome of control, dictating every breath of the children's lives. 6 o'clock means rising, 8 means porridge, 10 means stillness. The nursemaids consult it as if it were scripture, their glances toward it quick, reverent, fearful. When the youngest child cries, she does not go at once. Instead, she waits, watching the brass hands crawl toward the appointed feeding hour. "He must learn patience," she mutters, repeating words from Dr. Truby King's pamphlet on infant discipline. A mother's heart is soft, but the nurse must be firm. The baby's cries grow louder, frantic, until they fill the nursery like a storm trapped in glass. The sound trembles through the floorboards, yet still, no one moves. Victorian science has declared affection dangerous. Physicians warn that rocking or soothing a crying baby will weaken its moral fiber. They claim indulgence leads to corruption. A child who learns to command attention with tears will one day command disobedience. And so, love is rationed to exact intervals, measured like medicine. At precisely 9, the nurse lifts the baby, expression blank, as if affection itself could spoil the milk. She feeds him mechanically, bottle tilted, eyes fixed on the pendulum's arc. When the last drop is swallowed, she sets him down, wipes his mouth, and turns away. Below, the mother sits in her room, embroidery untouched. She knows the sound of her child's cries, has memorized their rhythm, but is forbidden from answering. The doctor insists it will pass, that maternal interference disturbs the nervous system. The nurse has been instructed to handle all needs. What the mother must cultivate, he says, is dignity. And dignity, in this era, means silence. By afternoon, the nursery air thickens with the smell of boiled oats and soap. The clock strikes 12. Children line up for lunch bowls placed before them with military precision. No one speaks until the last spoonful is taken. Those who dawdle are scolded for vanity. "Speed shows discipline," says the governess. Even digestion in this house must be obedient. When night comes, the pendulum slows in the dim glow of the hearth. The baby sleeps at last, his small fists clenched in surrender. The nurse rocks quietly in her chair, eyes heavy, repeating the mantra of her trade. Routine is mercy. Routine is love. Yet she knows deep down that what they call order often smells of neglect. Still, she obeys, for disobedience could cost her livelihood. Downstairs, the father winds his pocket watch and praises the household for its punctuality. Every tick feels like progress, every silence a sign of success. The house sleeps under the illusion of harmony, each heart beating to the tyranny of the same unyielding rhythm. In the nursery, the clock keeps swinging, patient, perfect, merciless, as another cry begins, too early to answer, too human to ignore. The cradle in the corner was the pride of the household, imported from London, carved from mahogany, and fitted with brass hinges that gleamed like candlelight. It was said to be modern, a marvel of progress, a mother's convenience. No one mentioned that it was built to make her unnecessary. At dusk, the nursery fills with the soft clicking of gears. The cradle begins to move on its own, swaying in slow, mechanical rhythm. Springs whisper beneath the wood, each motion steady, soulless, perfect. The nurse winds it carefully, counting under her breath 1, 2, 3, before stepping back to watch it work. The baby, bundled tight in white flannel, stirs and sighs, unsure whether to feel comforted or trapped. In another age, a mother's heartbeat would have been the rhythm that lulled a child to sleep. But in this house, human warmth is seen as weakness. The manuals call it sentimental interference. They say a mother's arms make a child clingy. That too much. Affection breeds defiance. Better, they argue, to let the machine do the rocking, predictable, tireless, unfeeling. The nurse repeats these truths as if they are hymns, her eyes darting toward the door lest anyone catch her humming. The mother knows the sound of that cradle by heart. She hears it through the ceiling as she dresses for dinner, that metronomic sway, creaking and sighing like an echo of her own denied instincts. Her husband compliments the device, calling it a marvel of the modern household. He does not notice how she flinches when it starts. To him, progress is measured in silence. The quieter the nursery, the more civilized the home. Later that night, when the house has gone still, she tiptoes upstairs in her nightgown. The nurse has retired to her cot, the lamps dim to embers. The cradle continues its motion, steady and endless. She kneels beside it, the air cool and smelling faintly of soap and iron. The baby's face glows faintly in the lamplight, its tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the machine. For a moment, she reaches out, not to adjust, not to fix, simply to touch. Her fingers brush the soft edge of the blanket, and the motion startles her, as if she's broken a rule that no one needed to speak aloud. The cradle does not care. It rocks on, tireless and blind, as though mocking her hesitation. She feels a sting of shame, not for what she's done, but for how long she waited to do it. The baby stirs, sighs, and quiets again. She leans closer and whispers, so softly that even the house can't hear, "You deserve a human hand." But dawn comes early in this century. The maid will rise, the bells will ring, and order will resume. The mother retreats to her room, leaving the machine to its perfect rhythm. Downstairs, the father's watch ticks in harmony with the cradle's sway, two instruments of control, winding the same silence through the walls. And above them all, in that still grey nursery, the cradle keeps moving, rocking itself in the dark, a symbol of progress and the slow mechanization of love. On the nursery shelf, beside the wooden alphabet blocks and the stack of linen bibs, lies a different kind of toy, a small bound book with gold lettering pressed into its spine, the principles of moral discipline. Its pages are thumbed soft from use. The nanny consults it often, quoting passages the way others recite prayers. "Correction," it says, "is mercy rightly applied." Beside the book hangs the rod, thin, polished, rarely idle. It is kept in plain sight, as if its presence alone could ward off disobedience. The children glance at it the way sailors watch a distant storm, hoping it won't reach them but knowing it will. Every household has one, sometimes more. Birch, cane, or strap, each chosen with care, as if the material matters when the purpose is pain. In the mornings, lessons begin with recitation, the Lord's Prayer, the alphabet, a list of sins and their punishments. The governess's voice is soft, steady, unflinching. She believes she is saving them, that a quick stripe across the palm now will prevent eternal ruin later. The children sit straight-backed on stools, their eyes fixed forward. When one fidgets, she pauses mid-sentence and turns. The silence stretches thin as glass. Then comes the command. Hands. A slap. A flinch. A whispered apology. Order restored. The lesson continues. Downstairs, the parents discuss obedience with the same detachment as household accounts. The boy must learn authority, says the father. Firmness shapes character. The mother nods but cannot meet his eyes. She remembers her own childhood, the cold mornings, the sting of the cane, the muffled sobs beneath the hymns. Her scars are invisible, yet they ache whenever she hears that word. Firmness. Upstairs, the governess marks another note in her ledger. She does not relish punishment. It is simply part of her duty, as routine as wiping a nose or tying a shoe. Each infraction is recorded neatly. Tuesday spoke without permission. Wednesday, idleness at arithmetic. The record will be shown to the parents at week's end, proof that discipline remains intact. When dusk settles over the house, the nursery takes on a strange stillness. The children whisper to each other in the dim light, their small hands tracing the bruises hidden beneath cuffs and collars. They do not speak of hate, they do not even know the word, only of how to avoid the next lesson. The eldest, barely 8, has learned that quiet earns safety, that tears invite sermons. He holds his brother close and murmurs, "Don't move when she looks at you." It sounds less like advice and more like prayer. The rod hangs where the light cannot reach it, gleaming faintly in the dark. The governess closes her book and blows out the candle, convinced she has done God's work. In another room, the mother kneels by her window, the muffled sound of crying rising through the floorboards. She tells herself it is for their own good, the same lie her mother told before her. And somewhere in the quiet between the clocks ticking, the wind outside carries a softer truth, that cruelty, when wrapped in scripture, can pass for love. By the time a Victorian child could walk, the real work of parenting began. The goal was not to nurture, but to conquer, to shape a creature born of instinct into a model of restraint. A child's will, wrote one of the era's favored moralists, is the serpent in the garden. Break it early, and salvation may yet be possible. Every nursery owned a copy. Every family followed it like gospel. Morning lessons began with posture, a thin rod balanced along the spine to correct any slouch. 10 minutes of stillness, no blinking, no fidgeting. The smallest movement brought a sharp rap to the knuckles. "Hold yourself upright," the governess murmured, as a gentleman must. For the girls, obedience was the higher virtue. A lady is quiet, modest, and invisible. The words were repeated daily until they ceased to sound like commands and became descriptions of what the children already were: small, silent, and careful. There were rules for everything: how to sit, how to breathe, how to hold one's tongue in the presence of elders. Disobedience was not met with anger, but with a ritual precision that chilled the soul. The punishment chair stood in the corner, facing the wall, where a painted angel watched from the wallpaper's faded sky. The child was made to sit until tears stopped and breathing slowed, not out of comfort, but exhaustion. When the father came to inspect, he would find serenity, not remorse, and consider the matter resolved. At dinner, conversation flowed over the children's heads like distant thunder. They were to be present, but unseen, perfectly still while the adults discussed the empire, the railways, the markets. A dropped fork or whispered question could summon a glare that froze the blood. Afterward, the nurse led them upstairs, where supper, plain bread and milk, waited as their only indulgence. The mother sometimes lingered at the door of the nursery, her hands twisting the lace of her sleeves. She could not forget her own training, the hours spent standing in corners, the prayers forced through clenched teeth, the long lessons in silence. And yet she felt the faint rebellion of her heart each time she saw her son's small shoulders stiffen at the sound of footsteps. She longed to take him in her arms, to say the word forbidden in this house: enough. But love, too, was an act of defiance here. At night, after prayers, the children were made to recite their faults aloud, a litany of misdeeds learned by heart. I was slow in obedience. I showed vanity. I spoke without leave. The governess nodded solemnly after each confession, blessing them for their honesty. When the lights were finally extinguished, the house fell into perfect silence, the kind that seemed almost holy. Yet in that stillness, something unholy was happening, the quiet erasure of self. Beneath the calm, the will did not vanish. It retreated. It hid deep within the chest of every small, trembling child, waiting for a future that might allow it to breathe again. Before breakfast, before the first word of the day is spoken, the children are stripped of their nightclothes and led to the washroom. The floor tiles are cold beneath their bare feet, the air sharp with winter and carbolic soap. Steam does not rise from the basin, there is no warmth here. The nursemaid pours water straight from the jug, the surface rippling with a film of ice. "Quickly now," she murmurs, though she knows there is no quickness in this ritual. Every child must learn to face the cold. The youngest whimpers as the first splash hits his shoulders. The nurse says nothing. To comfort would be to undo the lesson. It builds strength, she tells herself, repeating the doctor's prescription. Cold water hardens the constitution. Parents read this in manuals and medical journals alike. Illness, they were told, came not from filth but from softness. Disease was weakness of the spirit. A child who trembled at a basin was one who might falter in life. Upstairs, the mother stands by the bedroom window, listening to the echo of small cries rising through the pipes. She once believed these rituals were cruel, but cruelty, she has learned, is respectable when cloaked in science. The doctor who recommended it was a man of authority, celebrated for his theories on hygiene and discipline. He called it moral cleansing. Her husband had nodded approvingly at the phrase. "Nothing like a little chill to put fire in the blood," he'd said. After the bath, the children are rubbed briskly with coarse towels until their skin burns pink. The nurse checks their fingernails, their posture, their breath. "Stand straight, chins high," she reminds them. Windows are thrown open wide to let in the healthy air, even in January. Frost creeps along the glass. The smell of coal smoke from neighboring chimneys seeps in, mingling with the sharp scent of linseed oil and lye. The governess arrives for lessons an hour later, remarking on their pallor as a sign of virtue. "Rosy cheeks suggest indulgence," she says. "A disciplined child looks pale like porcelain." The children sit shivering through arithmetic, their fingers stiff around pencils. To move is to invite reprimand. Yet, as they work, the room fills with a fragile brightness. The cold hums through their bones, keeping them alert, obedient, small. At night, the same windows remain open, just an inch, no matter the weather. Fresh air, it is said, drives out vice. The nurse tucks them in tightly, sealing the blankets around their bodies so they cannot curl for warmth. She whispers a prayer as she leaves, not out of piety, but out of guilt. The door closes, and the draught moves softly through the room, carrying the distant toll of a carriage bell from the street below. In the still dark, the children lie awake, eyes wide, learning what every Victorian child must, that comfort is temptation, warmth is weakness, and love like heat is something that must be earned, never assumed. When a Victorian boy turned 7, his childhood was packed away in a small wooden trunk beside his linen shirts and Latin primers. That trunk would follow him to school, a place of prayer, hunger, and discipline, known among the children by quieter names, the House of Rules, the Hall of Tears. Parents spoke of it with pride. "He is off to make a man of himself," they said, as if love could be outsourced to architecture. The carriage ride to the boarding school was long and grey. Mothers dabbed their eyes with lace, careful not to stain their gloves. Fathers shook hands with their sons instead of embracing them. "Write to your mother," was the last thing most boys heard before the door closed. Behind the stone gates, the world grew colder. The headmaster waited in his black coat, face stern but polite. as though sorrow were an inconvenience. The first lesson began before dawn. Bells rang, boots marched, and dozens of small bodies moved in unison toward chapel. "Rise for God, not comfort," the prefects shouted. The air smelled of damp wool and candle smoke. Each child knelt on the wooden floor until knees ached, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. Piety and endurance were twins here. Tears were a mark of pride only if they came from prayer. Meals were a kind of ceremony: thin porridge, stale bread, water that tasted faintly of iron. Seconds were forbidden. To ask for more was greed. To refuse was insolence. Between meals, the boys learned Latin, scripture, arithmetic, and fear. The cane hung beside the blackboard, a silent witness to every mistake. The sound it made, that sharp, singing whistle before contact, was enough to keep order. Letters home were censored by the masters. A boy might write, "I am learning well," when what he meant was, "I am lonely." Mothers read those letters by lamplight, tears staining the paper, and told themselves it was necessary. "He must learn independence," they whispered, as if independence could bloom in confinement. At night, the dormitory breathed with the quiet sobs of 50 children. The gaslights burned low, flickering against the rows of iron beds. The older boys enforced silence, repeating the headmaster's words, "A man's dignity lies in self-control." The younger ones buried their faces in their pillows, trembling with homesick prayers that would never reach their mother's ears. Sometimes, a boy would wake from a nightmare and whisper to the child beside him, "Do you think they love us still?" The answer rarely came. The question was too dangerous, too tender. By morning, the crying had dried into habit. The boys marched to lessons, pale and polite, every trace of rebellion pressed smooth by the weight of routine. From the outside, the school looked immaculate, its gardens trimmed, its hymns echoing through the chapel windows. But inside, behind every bowed head, lived the same quiet truth, that tears, once forbidden, had simply learned new ways to hide. On the first Sunday of each month, the school allowed its pupils 1 hour to write home. The masters called it correspondence hour, a civilized tradition meant to reassure parents that their sons were thriving. The truth sat heavy behind the ink. The boys gathered at long tables beneath a portrait of the headmaster, dipping their pens in shared inkwells, their breath fogging the paper in the cold. The youngest struggled to remember what warmth felt like. The eldest had already learned to pretend. The rules were simple: write neatly, write politely, write nothing that would cause concern. The letters were inspected before posting, each one unfolded under a master's eye. Any mention of fear, hunger, or homesickness would be struck through with red ink or quietly burned in the grate. "Your parents have enough to worry about," the teachers said. "Spare them childish weakness." So the boys learned to compose small lies wrapped in good manners. "Dear mother, I am well." The teachers, "Food is excellent. I have many friends." Their handwriting trembled, but their sentences smiled. Each word a little betrayal. Some added drawings in the margins, small houses, fields. A mother's face remembered dimly, knowing they might be erased, but drawing them anyway. In the headmaster's office, the discarded letters told a different story. One read, "Please, Father, I cannot breathe when I wake. The air is so cold my hands shake all morning." Another, "Tell nurse I dream of her singing. Please let me come home." The ashes of such confessions dusted the hearth like snow. Meanwhile, in parlors miles away, mothers waited for the post with nervous smiles. They held the letters to their hearts before opening them, inhaling the faint scent of ink and starch. The words inside seemed reassuring enough: disciplined, mature, correct. "He sounds happy," they would say. But sometimes, reading by lamplight, a single uneven line betrayed the truth, an ink blot shaped like a tear. A sentence too carefully polite. "I am learning to be good," one boy wrote. His mother stared at the phrase for a long time, wondering what it cost him to write it. Back at the school, after correspondence hour ended, the boys were lined up for inspection. The master praised their neatness, their composure. Men in training, he called them. The fire crackled behind him, feeding on the ashes of the unsent letters. That night, when the gaslights dimmed, a few boys whispered their real letters into the darkness, not to paper, but to memory. Dear Mother, the nights are long. Dear Father, I try so hard to be brave. Dear God, please tell them I am still their child. Their voices faded into the slow breathing of the dormitory, swallowed by the heavy air. In the morning, the post arrived again, envelopes addressed in familiar hands, signed with careful love. None of the mothers knew that the answers they sent were being delivered to children who could no longer write back truthfully. And in that quiet exchange of lies, another layer of Victorian obedience was sealed, stamped, folded, and filed away with all the letters that never reached home. In a house ruled by clocks and silence, the nursemaid's voice was the only sound that dared to break the rules. She spoke softly, only when certain the walls weren't listening. Her words were small rebellions, lullabies, stories, comforts that had survived the crossing from her own mother's tongue. To the children, she was both shadow and savior, the single warmth in a world of starch and restraint. By daylight, she was the model of obedience, her cap pressed smooth, her apron spotless, her posture exact. The mistress trusted her, the master ignored her, and the governess resented her. Yet when the household retired and the lamps burned low, she became something else entirely, the keeper of forbidden tenderness. She would kneel beside the cradle, her hands rough from scrubbing, her voice trembling with forbidden gentleness. "Hush now," she would whisper. "The moon is watching. You mustn't let her think you're afraid." No one else spoke to the children that way. In this age, affection belonged to the lower orders, tolerated in servants, punished in mothers. The nursemaid knew her place, but she also knew the ache of loneliness. She saw it in the boys' downturned eyes, the girls' quiet fingers tracing the cracks in the wall. The nurse understood the language of hunger that had nothing to do with food. She fed it the only way she could, through stories. She told them of things they were never meant to imagine. Green fields, singing birds, summer rain on bare skin. Her tales were stitched from memory and myth, half true, half prayer. The children would lean closer, their faces pale in the candlelight, listening as if her voice were a doorway. For a moment, the nursery stopped feeling like a cage. The rules, the rods, the cold baths all fell away. In their place came warmth, fleeting but real. But every kindness in a Victorian home had its price. One night, as she hummed a cradle song too softly to be heard beyond the door, the tenture, governess entered without warning. The singing stopped mid-breath. "This is not a charity ward," the governess hissed. "They must learn discipline, not sentiment." The nursemaid bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am." Her hands, trembling, resumed folding the baby's blanket, each crease perfect. The governess left without another word, satisfied that order had been restored. Later, when the house was asleep, the nursemaid sat by the window, her candle guttering. She thought of her own child, buried in a parish yard years before, and how no one had ever told her not to sing to him. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, watching the moon drift past the rooftops. Somewhere beyond that window, the world still breathed. In the dark, a small voice whispered from the cot, "Will you sing again?" She hesitated, then smiled, weary but defiant. "Just once," she murmured, and began. The lullaby rose and fell like a secret the night itself promised to keep. And for a few stolen minutes, the nursery was no longer ruled by silence, but by love. Every grand house had one, though it went by different names. In some it was the correction chamber, in others the quiet room. But every child knew its true title, the punishment room. It was never shown to guests, never mentioned aloud. Yet its presence lingered in every corridor, an invisible warning stitched into the fabric of the home. At Thornley House, It hid behind the second-floor staircase, a narrow door without ornament. By day it looked like a closet. By night it became something else, a chamber of lessons too cruel to name. The governess kept the key pinned to her belt, her fingers brushing it whenever a child misbehaved. That sound, the faint jingle of metal, could silence laughter faster than any scolding. Inside, the walls were plain plaster, the windows shuttered. A single chair stood in the center, straight-backed and unyielding. On the wall hung a small wooden cross, its shadow bending across the floor like a reminder. The air was cold and dry, smelling faintly of soap and fear. Sometimes a child was left there for an hour, sometimes for longer, until repentance, the governess would say. Disobedience did not always mean defiance. It might be a giggle at the wrong time, a muddy hem, a moment of hesitation before curtsying. For the boys, it could be fidgeting during lessons or speaking without being asked. The purpose was never correction, it was transformation. To make the will pliant, to replace instinct with obedience. The sound of the latch closing was the sound of the old self being locked away. The mother of the house knew of the room but rarely entered. Once, she tried. She had heard her daughter crying from behind the door, a thin wail that clawed at the air. When she reached for the key, the governess intercepted her with a quiet firmness that bordered on command. "Madam," she said, "you must not interfere. This is for the child's betterment." The mother stepped back. Later, she would tell herself she had done the right thing, that mercy would have weakened the lesson. But that night, she could not sleep. Some children emerged from the punishment room silent for days. Others came out speaking too quickly, as if words themselves might keep the darkness away. They never spoke of what they thought about while locked inside. Only the nursemaid seemed to know. She would sit with them afterward, offering warm milk and gentle hands, whispering, "You're back now. You're safe." They never quite believed her. The governess wrote in her record book that the room was effective in restoring humility. Her handwriting was neat, almost elegant. Below it, she added a line from Proverbs, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." At night, when the wind passed through the shutters, the faint creak of the empty chair could be heard from the hallway. Some said it was the wood settling, others the echoes of lessons learned too well, but the children knew better. It was the sound of obedience breathing in the dark, waiting to be called upon again. In a Victorian home, hunger was not an accident, it was instruction. The cook prepared abundant meals for the family, their silver platters gleaming with roast beef, potatoes, and custard. Yet upstairs in the nursery, the children's plates were measured in silence. Thin porridge, hard bread, weak tea. To eat one's fill was indulgence. To crave was character. A child's appetite must be ruled like his spirit, the manual said. And so, the smallest portion became the daily sermon. The governess watched each bite as though it were a moral test. Chew slowly, swallow modestly, leave a little to show restraint. She had memorized these rules from the same book that prescribed cold baths and iron discipline. Food, in her mind, was a gateway to sin, gluttony, sloth, pleasure. Even the Lord fasted, she reminded them. Why should you be exempt? Breakfast came at 8, precisely. If a child dawdled, the plate was removed. If one complained of hunger before supper, they were sent to the corner to meditate on gratitude. The smallest boy, too young to count the hours, often cried before dusk. The nursemaid, unable to bear it, would sneak him a crust of bread when the governess's back was turned. "Shh, now," she'd whisper, pressing the crumb into his hand. "Don't tell, or she'll take it from us both." He would nod solemnly and eat it slowly, tasting the rebellion like honey. The mother, when she dined downstairs, thought of her children vaguely between courses. She'd once asked why they ate separately, why the nursery meals seemed so plain. The governess replied with practiced calm, "Too rich a diet weakens the constitution, madam. Plain food strengthens resolve." The mother accepted this, half relieved. The fewer the meals she attended, the less she had to witness. At night, The children were sometimes kept from supper as punishment. It could be for anything: a crooked bow, a misplaced word, a tear. Governess would lift her chin and declare, "No meal until the behavior is corrected." The offenders sat at their bedsides, staring at the wall while the smell of broth drifted from the kitchen below. The clock ticked slow and loud, measuring their repentance. One winter evening, the eldest girl fainted during recitation. Her hands were cold, her lips pale. The governess scolded her for dramatics, insisting she rise. But the nursemaid knelt and lifted her gently, feeling the frail weight of bones beneath fabric. "She's not disobedient," the nurse said softly. "She's starving." For that remark, she was dismissed the next morning. Days later, the governess recorded in her logbook, "Child improving, appetite moderate, behavior exemplary." The entry glowed with satisfaction. Yet in the hush of the nursery, something had shifted. The children began saving crumbs, hiding them beneath pillows or in pockets, sharing in silence like communion. Hunger had taught them more than discipline. It had taught them how to care for one another when no one else would. And in the smallest, secret acts of kindness, the first cracks appeared in the polished cruelty of the house. It began so quietly that no one noticed. The boy, once prone to humming as he stacked his wooden blocks, simply stopped one morning. No tantrum, no tears, only silence. The governess called it obedience. The mother called it progress. But the nursemaid, watching from the corner of the nursery, saw something else. The light in his eyes dimmed, the stillness of a creature that had learned fear too young. His name was Edward, though he rarely heard it spoken. In this house, names were used only for correction. Edward, stand straight. Edward, stop fidgeting. Edward, apologize. Praise was given to the group, never the individual. The governess said it prevented pride. The father said it built humility. So when Edward's words disappeared, no one thought to miss them. At first, they believed it temporary. "He's shy," the mother told a visitor. "He's reflective." But reflection had nothing to do with it. Edward had learned that speech drew danger. A question might be insolence, a laugh, disruption. Silence, however, was safe. Silence pleased everyone. The world above him seemed built for quiet, the whisper of skirts on staircases, the hush of conversations that ended when children entered the room. He had merely adapted to survive in it. Lessons became easier for the governess. The child who did not speak, could not argue, could not complain. She wrote to the parents of her success. The boy shows marked improvement in temperament. No outbursts for 10 days. She didn't mention that he no longer smiled, that his drawings were all of empty rooms and grey skies. Sometimes, the nursemaid tried to coax a word. She'd kneel beside him as he sat with his slate and whisper, "What are you thinking about, love?" But he would only look at her, eyes large and solemn, then return to tracing letters no one had asked him to write. He never erased them. When the slate filled up, he would turn it over and begin again, the same shapes, the same faint rhythm of a child remembering sound through motion. At meals, the other children learned to fill his silence. "Edward is good," said the eldest, eager to earn favor. "Edward never speaks out of turn." The governess smiled approvingly. "Then Edward shall be an example to you all." Edward looked down at his plate, the thin soup trembling in its bowl, and said nothing. He was already an example of what happens when fear becomes virtue. Months passed before anyone realized he no longer cried, either. The governess praised his composure. The father, home from business, patted his head with a rare flicker of pride. "That's the spirit," he said. That night, the nursemaid found Edward awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She reached for his hand and whispered, "You can talk to me, you know." His lips parted, but no sound came, only a breath, faint and uncertain, like the ghost of a word that no longer remembered its shape. Downstairs, the governess recorded, in her book, "Child cured of temper, perfectly silent," and for the rest of that winter, the house was at last as quiet as it had always wished to be. When Edward turned 8, the lessons stopped and the labor began. The governess said he had outgrown the nursery. The father called it opportunity. The industrial age was booming, and every able hand, no matter how small, had its use. Work will build his character, the father declared over breakfast. Better a factory floor than idleness. The mother said nothing. She only folded her napkin, her eyes fixed on the untouched plate before her. The following Monday, a carriage took Edward to the mill at the edge of town. It was dawn when he arrived, the sky still grey and low with soot. The building loomed like a living thing, its windows black, its chimneys breathing clouds. Inside, hundreds of machines roared in endless rhythm, their belts snapping through the air like whips. The overseer shouted instructions, but the noise swallowed his voice whole. Edward's job was to crawl beneath the spinning looms and clear away the cotton fluff that gathered there. He was small, quick, quiet, the perfect worker. The older boys showed him how to move fast enough to avoid the pistons, how to duck before the shuttles struck. "Don't stop for sneezing," one warned. "Don't stop for blood," Edward nodded. Words had long since become unnecessary. The days blurred together, marked only by the bell that tolled each shift. Breakfast was a crust of bread eaten standing up, dinner a ladle of watery stew. The air was thick with lint, coating his throat until each breath rasped like sand. When one of the girls coughed too loudly, the foreman sent her outside and she did not return. The others did not ask why. Questions wasted time. At night, the children trudged home along the canal, their faces pale under the gaslight. Edward's hands were blistered and grey with dust. Sometimes, the nursemaid would meet him at the door with a warm cloth and wipe them clean. "You should be in school," she whispered. He looked at her blankly, not from defiance, but exhaustion. The word school no longer meant anything. The father received wages in Edward's name. "A fine start," he told his wife. "By 14 he'll earn a man's pay." She smiled weakly and excused herself from the room. Upstairs, she pressed Edward's shirt to her face. It smelled of oil, smoke, and something faintly metallic, like the edge of despair. One winter morning, a spool jammed, and Edward hesitated too long. The machine caught his sleeve, dragging him forward. He screamed the first sound he had made in months, and the room froze. The overseer pulled the lever, stopping the gears just in time. A thin line of blood marked his arm. "Nothing more. Lucky boy," the man muttered, cuffing him on the shoulder. "Teaches you to mind the pace." That night, the nursemaid wrapped the wound and hummed her forbidden lullaby. Edward didn't speak, but for the first time in years, he reached out and held her hand until sleep came. The mill's rumble echoed faintly through the walls, the sound of a world that had found a way to make children useful before they were ever allowed to be young. The factory did not rest. Even in the dead of night, its chimneys exhaled like beasts half asleep, breathing black smoke into the frozen air. For the children who worked there, sleep was not a refuge but another form of labor, something rationed, supervised, and earned. Edward's shift ended at midnight, his eyelids raw with dust. He stumbled home through streets lined with gas lamps and fog, each light flickering like a weary pulse. Inside the tenement, the air was warmer but no cleaner. Coal soot clung to every surface, to the walls, the sheets, the children's hair. They slept in rows along the floor, their bodies curled around one another like kittens in a basket. The older ones coughed through the night, lungs protesting the cotton dust they'd swallowed all day. The foreman called it the mill cough. The doctor called it weak constitution. No one called it what it was, slow suffocation. Edward lay awake longer than most. His hands twitched even in rest, the muscles still remembering the rhythm of the looms. He could hear them in his dreams, the whirring, the slapping belts, the relentless heartbeat of machines that never tired. When sleep finally came, it came shallow, haunted by the sound of gears grinding endlessly on. In the morning, the children woke before dawn. There was no time for washing, barely time for bread. Their breakfast was eaten in motion, the crusts clutched between fingers still blackened with oil. Outside, frost coated the canal, and the water reflected the orange glow of the mill's windows. The world itself seemed powered by exhaustion. Sometimes, on Sundays, they were allowed to attend chapel. The priest would preach on humility and diligence, praising the noble poor for their endurance. "Every trial brings you closer to heaven," he said, his voice echoing in the cold nave. Edward wondered if heaven also smelled of smoke. Back at the mill, the overseer watched them work with the precision of a clockmaker. He was not cruel by temperament, only by profession. Efficiency was his creed. "The steam does not stop for sorrow," he once told Edward. "Neither should you." The mother visited once. Her husband had arranged it, proud to show how their son earned his keep. She arrived in a carriage, her gloved hands trembling as she stepped inside the mill. The noise hit her like heat. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she saw him smaller than she remembered, moving between the wheels with ghostly calm. He looked up, just once, eyes rimmed with red. Their gazes met, and then he turned back to his work, as if afraid to break the rhythm. That night, when the house was quiet again, the mother wept into her pillow, whispering apologies no one would hear. Edward, too, wept, though not from sadness, but from the grit caught in his eyes. The tears made small rivers through the dust on his cheeks before he fell asleep to the faint hum of the mill outside, the lullaby of soot and steam that sang the world to ruin. Down the street from the factory stood a narrow shop that sold toys not for the children who worked, but for the ones who were meant to be seen and not touched. In its window, beneath a haze of soot-streaked glass, rows of porcelain dolls watched the world with painted calm. Their curls were golden, their dresses immaculate, their faces unmarked by life. The finest among them had no eyes at all, only smooth porcelain where pupils should have been. They were made that way deliberately. "Too much expression encourages imagination," the shopkeeper liked to say. For the daughters of polite society, such dolls were not playthings, they were rehearsals. Each child was expected to treat her doll as a mirror, learning quietness and decorum through imitation. The manuals advised it plainly. Teach your daughter her maternal duties early. Affection can be trained like posture. In the nursery upstairs, a girl named Clara practiced every day. She brushed the doll's hair, buttoned its tiny shoes, and scolded it gently when it misbehaved. "Good girls don't cry," she whispered. "Good girls sit still." Her mother, seated at her writing desk nearby, smiled to see the lesson taking root. "A well-brought-up child is her mother's best ornament," she often said, copying the phrase from a popular ladies' magazine. She believed this sincerely. To her, gentleness meant composure, and purity meant silence. So when Clara's laughter grew too bright, the mother placed a finger to her lips. "Hush, my dear. A lady's voice should never echo through the house." Outside, the streets were alive with the noise of the factory children shouting, coughing, sometimes singing off-key as they carried water or coal. Clara had heard them once from her window and asked why they sounded so different. Her mother's answer came without hesitation: because they were not taught to behave. Clara nodded solemnly, clutching her sightless doll closer, as if to protect it from the chaos beyond the gates. But at night, when the candles burned low and the governess had gone, Clara would whisper secrets to her doll about the strange boys with blackened faces, about the smoke that never left the sky, about the dream she'd had where everyone could play in the same street. The doll, blank and beautiful, never answered. Its empty gaze held no comfort, only reflection. One morning, the doll's porcelain face cracked. Perhaps it fell, or perhaps Clara squeezed too hard during another silent tea party. The mother scolded her sharply, calling it carelessness. "You must learn gentleness," she said. "How will you ever be a good mother if you destroy what you are meant to love?" Clara apologized, tears slipping down her cheeks. That night, she placed the broken doll beside her bed and whispered, "I'm sorry I hurt you." Then she added, barely audible, "I didn't mean to be like them." In the dim light, the doll's blind face caught the flicker of the candle, cracked but gleaming, as if reflecting every rule that had ever taught a child how to love without warmth. When the fever swept through the neighborhood, the doctor came often. His carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones slick with coal dust, his black bag swinging like a pendulum of authority. To the families who could afford him, he was the voice of reason, calm, learned, certain. Mothers deferred to his every word. Fathers quoted him at dinner. In a world that mistrusted emotion, science had become the new scripture, and doctors its priests. Dr. Whiteley was a man of his time, confident, meticulous, and utterly convinced that compassion was a danger to health. He believed affection weakened a child's nerves, that too much comfort bred hysteria. Children must be treated as small adults, he declared. Their emotions are like weeds best pruned early. His lectures were printed in journals and praised by society matrons who longed for instruction on the correct way to feel nothing. When he entered the nursery at Thornley House, the air itself seemed to stiffen. The governess stood at attention, the nursemaid bowed her head, and the mother folded her hands nervously, awaiting judgment. The doctor removed his gloves, peered at the children, and made notes in a small leather book. Pale, but disciplined, he observed. Good. A child should not appear robust. It suggests indulgence. He examined their posture, their pulse, their obedience. When the youngest flinched at his touch, he frowned. Nervous disposition, he muttered. Too much female interference. No doubt. The mother blushed, ashamed, though she didn't know why. Dr. Whiteley prescribed tonics, cod liver oil, and reduced affection. Limit caresses to once daily. Reassurance confuses the constitution. The nursemaid, standing near the cradle, dared to ask, "And if the child cries, sir?" "Let it," he replied, snapping his bag shut. Lungs strengthen through use. A crying infant is merely exercising nature's instrument. That evening the mother followed his advice. When her daughter reached for her, she hesitated, remembering his warning. "The doctor says too much holding will make you frail," she whispered, stepping back. The child's hands lingered in the air, uncertain, before falling to her sides. Across the room, the governess nodded approvingly. "Discipline begins early," she said. Weeks passed. The children grew quieter, paler, perfectly compliant. The doctor was pleased. He wrote another article praising the family's devotion to modern science. "Sentimentality," he concluded, "is the enemy of progress." His words spread across parlors and schools, quoted like gospel by mothers seeking reassurance that restraint was virtue. Only the nursemaids saw what progress looked like up close, the children's hollow eyes, their thin arms folded neatly on starched laps. She tried to tell the mother once, but the woman only repeated the doctor's advice. It's for their good. One night, when the fever finally reached the nursery, Dr. Whiteley was called again. He examined the eldest boy, now still as porcelain, and said softly, "He felt nothing, I'm sure." Then he gathered his gloves, his notes, and his certainty, leaving behind a house cured of tenderness and a silence that no medicine could heal. Sunday morning came cloaked in smoke from the chimneys, but inside the parlor all was bright brass and polished mahogany. The family prepared for church with the same precision they brought to every duty. The mother adjusted her gloves, the father checked his watch. The children stood in a line like carved figurines waiting to be placed back on the shelf of God. Religion, in their house, was less a comfort than a command. The church bells tolled like iron hearts in the fog, calling the faithful and the fearful. The sermon was already known before it began. Obedience, humility, correction. The vicar, a narrow man with a voice like cold metal, spoke of sin that began in the cradle. "The willful child," he intoned, "invites ruin upon his soul. Spare not the rod, for discipline is divine love made visible." The congregation murmured its agreement, heads bowed in practiced shame. The children sat in the pew, legs dangling, their breath clouding in the chill. Edward, his hands, still bandaged from the mill, stared at the marble angels above the altar. Their faces were calm, but their eyes, painted wide and blank, reminded him of Clara's doll. He wondered whether angels ever wept, or if heaven too demanded composure. After the sermon came catechism. Each child recited verses under the watchful eyes of both God and parent. Wrong answers brought disapproval, hesitation earned correction. The smallest girl stumbled on the phrase, "I fear the Lord." She whispered it too softly, and the governess pinched her shoulder. "Louder, child, the Lord must hear your fear." The girl obeyed, trembling as her voice filled the nave. Fear was the foundation of all things in this world, the mortar that held faith and family together. Fear of sin, fear of poverty, fear of shame. The parents feared society's judgment, the children feared their parents, and everyone feared the silence that followed when the church doors closed. The vicar preached that fear was holy. "A trembling soul is one closest to grace," he said, and so they trembled. At home, the family dined in Sunday quietude. The father read aloud from Proverbs while the mother served cold meat and watered wine. "He who spareth the rod hateth his son," the father recited. The children bowed their heads, not daring to meet one another's eyes. The house, washed in candlelight, seemed almost reverent, yet underneath that reverence lived something colder, an invisible chain binding each heart to its duty. When night fell, the governess led them through evening prayers. "Confess your faults," she said, "for the Lord sees all." Each child knelt, reciting their sins, talking too loudly, thinking ungrateful thoughts, wanting what others had. When they finished, the room went still. Outside, wind rattled the shutters like restless hands. As the candles burned low, Edward whispered to the smallest girl, "Do you think God ever wanted us to be scared?" She didn't answer. But when the flame finally died and the room sank into darkness, they both felt it, that same small pulse of fear that had become, in this age, indistinguishable from faith. In the parlour of Thornley House, a new shipment arrived from London, a collection of educational amusements, recommended by the household guardian as ideal gifts for moral instruction. The boxes were tied with satin ribbon and smelled faintly of varnish. Inside lay small wonders of Victorian invention: alphabet blocks, arithmetic puzzles, miniature looms, and dolls that blinked when properly wound. But these toys were not meant to delight. They were meant to discipline. Each came with a booklet explaining its use. The virtue blocks taught spelling and obedience. If a child misarranged the letters, they were to sit in silence until the correct word, duty, honor, faith, was formed. The mechanical doll was said to reward good behavior by nodding when a task was completed correctly, but only if wounded by an adult. When it failed to move, the child was scolded for displeasing the toy. The governess was especially fond of the spinning top known as the industrious whirl. A small brass counter measured each rotation. Fewer than 50 spins meant laziness. She would place it on the table and instruct, "Spin until the number is right." Harder work brings longer joy. The irony escaped everyone but the nursemaid, who once whispered to herself that even toys were slaves now. The children quickly learned to dread playtime. Games became examinations, laughter and error. "You mustn't grow idle," the governess reminded them. "Idleness invites wickedness." So the toys remained lined neatly on the shelf, staring out from their boxes like prisoners of virtue. Clara, the eldest girl, tried to love them as she was told. She set her cracked doll in a chair and spun the top dutifully, counting each turn. 48, 49, 50. The toy wobbled and fell. "Lazy hands," the governess sighed. "Try again." When guests visited, the mother displayed the collection proudly. "See how industrious they are," she said, gesturing to her children bent in silence over their educational pursuits. The visitors smiled approvingly. "How very modern," one murmured. "Play should always serve a purpose." After the guests left, the room returned to stillness. The clock ticked, The toys gleamed faintly in the dim light. Edward sat apart, staring at the spinning top as it slowed, its hum fading into the quiet. The nursemaid, passing through with her duster, paused beside him. "It doesn't have to be perfect, you know," she said softly. He glanced up. Startled affection was rarer than praise here. "It does for her," he whispered, nodding toward the governess's shadow by the door. That night, when the house slept, the nursemaid gathered the toys from the table and placed them gently in a drawer. "Even the saints deserve rest," she muttered. But before she could close it, she noticed Edward's small hand slipping one of the alphabet blocks into his pocket, the one carved with the letter F. "Why that one?" she asked. He looked at her with solemn eyes and said, "It's the first letter of free." She said nothing, only smiled, and let him keep it a small rebellion hidden in the folds of a world that had forgotten what play was for. When the cholera wave swept through the city, the newspapers filled with lists of names, whole families blotted out in a single column of print. Among them were countless children suddenly unclaimed, their futures bundled into ledgers and parish records. The Victorians called it tragedy, but the institutions called it opportunity. The gates of Street Agnes Orphan Asylum stood tall and iron black, their bars polished like virtue. Inside, a world of order awaited. Whitewashed dormitories, long tables, rows of identical shoes. A home for the unwanted, the matron liked to say, where gratitude replaces grief. The walls were hung with scripture, "God chastens those he loves," and each morning began with prayer, followed by porridge so thin one could see the bottom of the bowl. For many of the children, this was mercy. Here, they said, no rods swung without reason, no parent's temper to fear. But mercy in the 19th century was often indistinguishable from discipline. Every act of kindness came measured and conditional. The orphans were told daily that their salvation lay in obedience. Gratitude was the currency of survival. Among them was a girl named Elsie, small for her 9 years, with hair the color of ashes and a habit of staring through people as if they were windows. She had come from the workhouse after her mother's death and learned quickly not to speak of before. The matron called her clever but defiant, a dangerous combination in any child, doubly so in a girl. The asylum ran like a machine. Older children scrubbed floors and stitched uniforms for the younger ones. Lessons were held in a drafty hall, where a wooden crucifix watched from above. The instructor, a weary curate in spectacles, taught reading through scripture, arithmetic through the counting of sins. He believed poverty itself was proof of moral failing. "You were born to serve," he reminded them, "and service is holiness." At night, Elsie shared a narrow bed with another girl, the two of them whispering under their blanket. "Do you think God knows we're here?" her companion asked. "He must," Elsie replied. "He made everyone else forget." She did not mean it bitterly, only as fact. Once a month, visitors came. Philanthropists, patrons' wives, those who found charity fashionable. They admired the neat rows of children, the polished manners, the absence of tears. "How grateful they seem," they would remark, leaving coins in envelopes. The matron curtsied deeply, her smile tight as laced corsetry. What they never saw were the small mercies the children gave one another. Crusts of bread shared beneath blankets, a whispered joke that risked punishment, a lullaby hummed after lights out. In those moments, kindness existed without permission, fragile, fleeting, but real. Years later, some of those children would look back on Street Agnes and call it salvation. Others would call it survival. Both would be right. For in a society that prized propriety above humanity, the orphans, stripped of everything, discovered the one advantage denied to the well-bred, the freedom to love without approval. In the polite parlors of Victorian England, there was no word for what happened to women after childbirth, when the light in their eyes dimmed and their laughter slipped away. The physicians called it melancholia puerperalis, a phrase that sounded almost elegant, like an ailment of lace and letters rather than despair. Neighbors called it nerves. Husbands called it inconvenience. And so, one by one, the mothers disappeared. Sometimes they left quietly, sent to rest at seaside clinics or country retreats where the air was meant to cure sorrow. Other times, they were taken from their homes in the middle of the night, bundled into carriages bound for asylums whose walls swallowed names whole. The house, meanwhile, rearranged itself around the absence. The nursery door stayed closed for a week. The nursemaid told the children that Mama had gone to recover her strength. No one said from what. At Thornley House, the absence of a mother was managed like any other domestic matter. The governess simply absorbed her duties, supervision, discipline, devotion, in its measured form. "Children mustn't dwell on illness," she said. "It breeds weakness." The father avoided the nursery altogether, his grief neatly folded into his waistcoat pocket. The only sign of unease was the faint scent of the mother's perfume, still clinging to the curtains in the drawing room. Doctors wrote confidently about such cases in their journals. Women of delicate temperament, they explained, are prone to exhaustion of the mind. The cure, they claimed, was isolation, no reading, no writing, no stimulation of any kind. Rest in its purest form, lying still, eyes open, waiting for the self to return. Few did. The famous physician Dr. Mitchell called it the rest cure, though many of his patients emerged not rested but erased. In houses like Thornley, the remaining women learned caution. Daughters watched their mothers vanish and vowed never to show too. Much sadness, too much thought. Emotion was dangerous. Silence, survivable. The nursemaid, older and less cautious, kept small tokens of sympathy, a ribbon left on a pillow, a whispered story of a mother who'd recovered in some far-off place. She knew better than to hope aloud. One afternoon, the post brought a letter with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, the looping, delicate script of the vanished mistress. The envelope contained only a pressed violet and a single line. "Tell them I am resting in peace." The father burned it unread, muttering that it must be a cruel joke. The nursemaid, who saw the flower before it turned to ash, pocketed a petal and hid it in her prayer book. The children grew, their memories of their mother fading like sunlight through gauze. Sometimes, when the youngest laughed too freely, the governess would purse her lips and say, "Don't be silly, your mother never carried on so." And in that moment, the child learned what every Victorian daughter eventually did, that a woman's disappearance was not tragedy, but decorum, the final, quiet lesson in how to fade gracefully from her own life. It was kept in the father's study, hanging behind the door like a shadow that never slept. The belt, thick leather, polished dark with years of handling, it was both object and omen, a symbol of authority so absolute it didn't have to move to command fear. The children learned its language early. The faint creak when the father adjusted his waistcoat, the sigh of the strap as it left its hook, the silence that followed. The first time Edward saw it used, he was 6. His brother had dropped a teacup during supper, shattering it against the floor. The sound was small, but the stillness that followed was enormous. Their father didn't shout. He didn't need to. He rose from his chair, removed the belt with deliberate calm, and told the boy to hold out his hand. The child obeyed. Pain came next, quick, sharp, perfectly measured. The lesson. Control begins where comfort ends. In Victorian homes, punishment was called correction, and it was said to build both moral fibre and gratitude. Spare the rod, spoil the child, hung framed in many parlours, as though cruelty could be sanctified by embroidery. Mothers were told to avert their eyes, softness would only confuse the children, and so they sat still, hands folded, while their sons and daughters learned that love was conditional and mercy unmanly. At Thornley House, the ritual was efficient. A servant summoned the child. The father delivered the punishment. The governess recorded it in her ledger. The nursemaid cleaned the wounds and said nothing. 5 lashes for insolence, the entry might read. 3 for defiance. The ink dried neatly, proof that the household's virtue was intact. Sometimes the father's anger was less about disobedience than about fatigue. A poor harvest, a business deal gone wrong, a sleepless night, all might find their resolution in the strike of leather against skin. Afterward, he would pour himself a glass of brandy and sigh as though balance had been restored. "Children must know who rules them," he would say. The mother would nod, though her lips trembled. The children learned to read his moods like scripture, the set of his jaw, the clink of his glass, the way his footsteps slowed before the study door. Fear made them obedient. Obedience made them invisible. Even laughter became dangerous, a spark that might ignite the quiet tension of the house. One winter evening, after Edward returned late from the mill, the belt found him waiting. "You will not shame this family," his father said. The boy stood still, eyes dry. Pain had long since lost its novelty. When it was over, he bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you, sir." The words came automatically, like a prayer recited in the dark. Upstairs, the nursemaid pressed a cold cloth to his shoulders. "You don't have to thank him," she murmured. He looked at her with calm, hollow eyes. "I do," he said. "If I don't, he'll think it didn't work." Downstairs, the father replaced the belt on its hook, satisfied that the world, at least within his walls, was once again in perfect order. By daylight, Thornley House looked serene, lace curtains drawn, brass polished, children seen and not heard. Visitors often remarked upon its harmony. "Such well-behaved little ones," they'd say, admiring the way Clara curtsied without glancing up, how Edward spoke only when spoken to. To the outside world, this was the model of Victorian success. Discipline mistaken for virtue, silence mistaken for peace. But inside the walls, every smile was rehearsed, every gesture a small act of survival. The children had been trained to perform goodness as though it were a part of their uniform. Praise was the closest thing to affection they could earn, and it always came with a condition. "Such an obedient child," the governess would murmur. "You make your father proud." So they obeyed, not out of love but out of fear of disappointing the fragile calm that held the house together. At breakfast, no one spoke unless prompted. The father read the newspaper, the mother poured tea. The children sat with hands folded, careful not to clatter their spoons. Even their movements were quiet, precise, deliberate, ghostly. The nursemaid had once joked that they could walk through a room without stirring the air. No one laughed. The illusion of harmony was the family's greatest accomplishment. Every creak of the floorboard was muffled, every emotion neatly pressed out of sight like wrinkles in linen. The mother, pale and careful, often stood by the window after the children were dismissed, watching them cross the garden in a line. They looked perfect from a distance, miniature adults, polished and purposeful. She told herself it meant she had succeeded where her own mother had failed. But when she turned from the window, her eyes always lingered on the empty chairs, as if listening for the sound of laughter she could not remember. One evening, during a visit from the vicar, Clara dropped her embroidery needle. It rolled across the carpet and came to rest near his boot. Her father's glare froze her mid-breath. The vicar smiled, oblivious. "Accidents happen," he said kindly, but the father's hand tightened around the arm of his chair. After the guests departed, silence fell heavy as ash. "A lady does not make scenes," he told her quietly. The reprimand was worse than shouting. Clara curtsied, tears held rigid in her throat. The illusion would not break again. The nursemaid, watching from the doorway, felt the ache of helplessness that had no name. Later, when the house slept, she found Clara sitting upright in bed, her doll clutched tightly in her lap. "I was good today," the girl whispered. "But it didn't matter." The nursemaid smoothed her hair. "Sometimes goodness isn't what they want, love. It's silence." Clara nodded. "Then I'll be the quietest of all." Outside, the wind sighed against the shutters. The house, pleased with itself, settled into another night of perfect calm. From the street, it appeared, peaceful, a picture of domestic grace. But if anyone had pressed an ear to the window, they might have heard it, the faint, unnatural quiet of a home where even goodness had learned to hold its breath. There were houses in Victorian England where touch was rare, and then there was Thornley, where it was nearly extinct. Even in moments that begged for warmth, a scraped knee, a fever, a nightmare, hands hesitated in mid-air before falling uselessly to the side. It wasn't that they didn't feel love, it was that they feared it. Touch, like laughter or noise, was unruly, something best kept behind closed doors, if allowed at all. The father set the rule himself, long ago. Affection weakens resolve. It had been his father's rule too, and the one before that. Men of Thornley did not kiss their children, nor cradle them. Their touch existed only in correction, a hand to straighten posture, a palm to silence fidgeting, the belt for sin. He saw it as legacy, not cruelty. The mother, raised under the same creed, obeyed it without question, though it hollowed her from within. She remembered the first time she'd reached for Edward's hand in church. He was 3, restless, his legs swinging over the pew. Without thinking, she had brushed her fingers across his to quiet him. The father's hand came down on hers, gentle but firm. He must learn self-control, he whispered. The moment passed like a shiver through her bones. She never tried again. As the children grew, the absence of touch became its own kind of presence, heavy, electric, and everywhere. The air seemed to hum with things unsaid. When the governess tied Clara's corset strings, she did so briskly, with gloved hands. When the nursemaid brushed Edward's hair, she worked quickly, fearful of being seen. Only in illness did the rule waver. Fever made the boundaries blur. A cool cloth on the forehead, a hand to steady trembling shoulders, those mercies were tolerated, but never spoken of afterward. The children learned to comfort themselves. They held on to their dolls, their blankets, even each other when no one watched. At night, Clara sometimes crept into Edward's narrow bed during storms, her breath trembling. "They'll hear you," he would whisper. "I don't care," she'd answer, pressing her hand against his arm just to feel that he was real. The mother, meanwhile, drifted through her days like a ghost in silk. She longed to touch them, to smooth Edward's hair, to cup Clara's cheek, but her own body refused her. Years of restraint had turned tenderness into shame, so she poured her affection into small acts. A second sugar cube in the children's tea, an extra blanket folded quietly at the foot of their beds. She hoped they would understand these gestures for what they were, love disguised as order. One night, when the father was away, the nursemaid caught her standing by Clara's bed, her fingers hovering just above the sleeping girl's forehead. She didn't move for a long time. Finally, she lowered her hand and whispered, "I'm sorry," before slipping away into the dark. The next morning, Clara woke with the faint warmth of that touch still on her skin. She couldn't name it, only that it felt like sunlight through frost, and for the first time, she began to wonder if love, no matter how forbidden, always found its way back through the cracks. It began with a cough, the soft, wet kind that clings to a child's throat and echoes through the stillness of night. At first, no one worried. The nursemaid brewed barley water, the governess opened the window for fresh air, but by morning, Clara's face burned red beneath the pallor, her lips cracked, her breath shallow. The sickness spread quickly, first Edward, then the youngest boy, their small bodies shaking under linen sheets. The doctor was summoned at once. Dr. Whiteley arrived, smelling of tobacco and confidence. He examined the children with gloved hands, his breath clouding in the cold room. "A mild fever," he declared, brought on by excess warmth and coddling. His prescription: no fire in the nursery, fewer blankets, and strict quiet. "Rest," he said, "requires discipline." The mother nodded, though her hands trembled. The nursemaid bit her tongue so hard it drew blood. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. The windows, kept open by the doctor's order, rattled in the wind. The children whimpered in their sleep, breath visible in the lamplight. The mother sat beside the bed, counting each inhale like a prayer. Every maternal instinct screamed to close the shutters, to hold them against her chest, to defy reason for the sake of warmth. But she remembered the doctor's warning: maternal hysteria complicates recovery, and forced her hands to remain still in her lap. The nursemaid could bear it no longer. When the mother finally dozed in exhaustion, she crept across the room, shutting the windows with trembling fingers. She lit the smallest fire she dared and rubbed the children's cold hands between her own. "Hush now," she whispered. "You'll wake the angels if you cry too loud." She knew the risk dismissal, disgrace, but the crackle of the fire felt holier than any sermon. By dawn, the fever had broken in 2 of the children. Edward's skin cooled to a pale dampness, his breathing steady. Only Clara still burned, her cheeks flushed with the color of danger. The doctor returned, displeased. "Too much interference," he snapped. "You've undone my regimen." He ordered the fire extinguished. The windows opened again. The nursemaid obeyed, silent but defiant, her eyes on Clara's small, trembling hands. Days passed. The fever took its course, unpredictable, punishing, indifferent. Each morning brought either hope or dread. The father paced the hall. The mother prayed aloud, her voice cracking on every syllable. "Lord, teach us patience," she whispered. But what she meant was, "Please don't take her." When the fever finally broke for good, it left its mark. Clara's cough lingered, her strength gone. The doctor took credit for her recovery. "Science prevails," he said, tipping his hat as he departed. The mother thanked him, though tears blurred her vision. That night, when the house slept, the nursemaid slipped into the nursery and tucked the blanket higher over Clara's shoulders. "Your mother kept the fire burning in her heart, even if she couldn't show it," she murmured. Clara's eyelids fluttered. "I know," she whispered faintly. Outside, frost glistened on the windowsills, proof that mercy sometimes came in secret, lit quietly in the dark where reason dared not go. When Edward and the other Thornley children were finally old enough to attend lessons beyond the nursery, they were sent to the parish school on the edge of town, a long, grey building that looked more like a barracks than a place of learning. Each morning, they marched there under the governess's watchful eye, shoes polished, collars starched, expressions blank. "A child's duty," she reminded them, "is not to enjoy, but to improve." The school smelled of chalk, ink, and damp wool. The windows were high and narrow, letting in light only enough to remind the pupils of the world they could not see. Desks were lined in perfect rows, each fitted with an inkwell and a list of rules tacked to the side. Sit straight. Speak only when addressed. Obedience is knowledge. The schoolmaster, Mr. Wilmot, enforced them with precision. He was a tall, lean man whose mouth almost never smiled, though his teeth were always visible, an expression that hovered between kindness, cruelty. The townsfolk praised him as a man of principle, a reformer. "No child under his watch grows idle," they said. They were right. The children did not grow idle. They simply stopped growing in every other way. Mr. Wilmot believed learning was an act of conquest. "The mind must be ruled as the empire rules its colonies," he once told a parent. He lectured for hours on grammar, arithmetic, and moral conduct, his cane tapping in rhythm against the floorboards. Every error, a mispronounced word, a blot of ink, a daydream met the same correction, a single strike across the knuckles. "Pain," he said, "is the purest teacher." Edward endured it quietly. He had long since learned that endurance brought invisibility, and invisibility was safety. But not all his classmates understood the rule. One boy, Thomas Briggs, laughed during a recitation when a bird flew into the room, scattering papers. The class froze. Mr. Wilmot's smile widened not with amusement, but with ceremony. "Step forward, Mr. Briggs," he said. The punishment was swift, the sound of leather against skin sharp as thunder. When it was done, Thomas bowed, tears streaking his cheeks. "Thank the master," came the order. He did. At home, Edward said nothing about the beatings. His father called the school a fine institution. His mother pressed a coin into his hand each Monday for the collection box and told him to make us proud. Pride was a word Edward had learned to fear. It meant submission, disguised as virtue. One day, Mr. Wilmot praised him publicly. "A model pupil," he announced, resting his hand on Edward's shoulder. His fingers were cold, his smile thin. The class clapped timidly. Edward didn't move. He felt the weight of that touch, not affectionate, but possessive, and realized that even approval in this world could feel like punishment. That night, he wrote his first real sentence in secret, on a scrap of paper hidden beneath his mattress. "Learning should not hurt." The ink blotched, the handwriting uneven, but the words were whole. He couldn't show anyone, of course. Yet for the first time, he felt the faint warmth of something that had no place at Thornley, or the schoolhouse, the quiet rebellion of thinking for himself. Sunday was the only day in Thornley House that began without the ringing of the school bell or the snap of the governess's orders. Yet it was not rest the children anticipated, it was ceremony. The Sabbath was the family's theatre of righteousness, a weekly performance of piety before God, neighbors, and one another. The house awoke before dawn to the rustle of starch and the hiss of irons. The children were scrubbed, brushed, and buttoned until they shone like porcelain figures. The mother oversaw every detail. Ribbons straight, collars tight, shoes polished until their reflections stared back. The father inspected them in silence, his gaze sharp as glass. "A family must be an example," he said. "God notices slovenliness as surely as sin." Breakfast was plain bread, tea, no chatter. Only the scrape of knives and the murmur of the Lord's Prayer passed between them. Then came the walk to church, a silent procession through streets slick with dew. Passers-by would nod approvingly, mistaking their stillness for grace. No one saw the strain behind it, the shallow breaths, the pinched fingers, the small hand that trembled each time the father's shadow lengthened across the cobblestones. The church itself was cold, a vault of marble and echo. The sermon was always the same: obedience, restraint, fear disguised as faith. The vicar thundered from the pulpit about the wages of disobedience. "Children, honor your parents. Wives, submit to your husbands. Servants, obey your masters, for such is the order of heaven." The congregation murmured, "Amen," a word that in that place meant acceptance more than belief. Edward and Clara sat side by side in the front pew, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on the altar. The smell of wax and wool mingled with incense until it clung to their throats. When the hymns began, Clara sang softly, her voice trembling. The governess hissed, "Louder, child." So she sang louder, until her own notes startled her. The father's hand brushed her shoulder, not affection, just warning, and she quieted again. After the sermon came the catechism. The vicar questioned them before the entire congregation, each response rehearsed to precision. "What is your duty?" "To submit." "And your reward?" "Heaven, if found worthy." The congregation smiled. The father nodded. The mother dabbed her eyes with lace, proud of their composure. When they returned home, the family dined in silence. The father reading aloud from scripture between bites. "The righteous shall be chastened," he read, "and the humble shall be lifted up." The words sounded like a promise, but felt like a sentence. After dinner, the children were sent to their rooms for reflection. They knelt beside their beds, as expected, whispering prayers of gratitude. But Clara's whispered words were different that day. "Dear Lord," she murmured, "please make next Sunday rain." Downstairs, the father praised the peace of his household, convinced that God himself must smile upon such order. Yet above him, behind closed doors, two small figures prayed not for salvation, only for the mercy of interruption. In the narrow back streets of London, far from the polished houses of families like the Thornleys, stood a workshop that smelled of cedar and oil. Its windows were dusted with saw filings, its counters cluttered with half-finished toys, wooden horses without legs, dolls' heads waiting for eyes, music boxes that hummed broken tunes. Behind the counter worked Mr. Greaves, the toy maker, whose hands trembled from age and guilt in equal measure. He had been making toys for nearly 40 years, first for laughter, then for silence. When he began, his creations were meant to delight. Painted birds that sang, spinning tops that gleamed like jewels, dolls with glass eyes that seemed almost alive. But the age had changed, and with it the demands of his patrons. Mothers no longer asked for toys that entertained. They asked for ones that instructed. Something that keeps them still, they'd say. Something that teaches obedience. And so, he adapted. The shelves filled with toys that punished as they played, dolls that scolded when wounded, jack-in-the-boxes that snapped shut too early, alphabet cubes engraved with prayers instead of letters. His finest creation was called the Virtue Engine, a clockwork device that rewarded children with a chime when they sat motionless long enough. It sold hundreds. He told himself it was progress, a contribution to modern child-rearing. But each night, when he closed the shop, the quiet pressed on him like a weight. One evening, Clara and Edward were brought in by the governess, their hands folded neatly, their eyes wary. "We require something moral," she told him. "They've grown restless." Mr. Greaves studied them, the stiffness of their shoulders, the hollow obedience in their gaze. Children who looked more like porcelain than flesh. "You don't need toys," he said softly before he could stop himself. "You need time in the sun." The governess frowned. "Time in the sun breeds idleness," she snapped. "Have you nothing suitable?" Reluctantly, he showed her a new invention, a doll that bowed when its owner recited scripture correctly. "Perfect," she said. "The children must learn reverence." She paid in silver and left, ushering the two small ghosts out into the fog. Mr. Greaves watched them go, the bell above the door chiming once like a sigh. That night, he stayed in his workshop long after the lamps burned low. He found himself surrounded by the things he had built, all those mute, mechanical lessons in virtue. Their faces seemed to watch him, accusingly. He took one of the unfinished dolls and, instead of carving another polite smile, pressed its lips closed entirely, sealing it forever in silence. In the morning, he packed away his tools for good. "I made them forget how to play," he whispered, and the world called it progress. When the governess returned months later seeking another moral contraption, she found the shop empty. The sign above the door warned to blankness. Only one toy sat in the window, a small wooden child, its hands raised as if reaching for something just beyond the glass. Beneath it, a single card in fading ink read, "Forgive me." By the late 1880s, the physicians of England had found a new disease, one that infected only women, one that could not be measured by pulse or temperature, and yet was said to threaten the very fabric of the household. They called it maternal overindulgence. The newspapers called it the affectional malady, and men like Dr. Whiteley called it weakness disguised as tenderness. The diagnosis spread quickly, whispered through parlors and schools, discussed in medical journals beside diagrams of the female brain. Mothers who kissed their children too often, who stayed beside their sickbeds too long, who wept when they were punished, all were said to suffer from a disorder of nerves and sentiment. The treatment was simple, removal from the cause. The cause was love. At Thornley House, the illness found a name before it found a cure. The mother, pale, tremulous, her eyes red from sleepless nights, had begun to show signs of what the doctor called emotional fatigue. She lingered too long at the nursery door, her voice too gentle, her tears too visible. "It's not natural," Dr. Whiteley told the father. "Excessive attachment weakens both parent and child. If she continues, they will mirror her instability." And so the cure began. She was confined to her room, her books removed, her curtains drawn. "Rest is the medicine," the doctor said, prescribing milk, quiet, and distance. The children were forbidden to visit. If they asked where their mother had gone, the governess replied, She is unwell, the doctor says. She must forget her nerves. At first, the mother obeyed. She sat in her chair by the window, hands folded, trying to breathe the way the doctor instructed. Shallow, measured, emotionless. But the air grew heavy with absence. She began to count the hours by the sound of the children's footsteps below, each one a small ache in her chest. When she asked to see them, the nursemaid was sent to deliver a warning. Your illness is affection, madam. You must learn restraint. Weeks turned to months. The mother wrote letters she never sent, pages filled with half sentences, like prayers. Remember to eat slowly. Don't fear the dark. Tell Edward he was never bad. She hid them beneath the loose floorboard near her bed, knowing the act itself was a betrayal of her recovery. Downstairs, the children were told to be grateful. Your mother is resting for your sake, the governess said. They believed her, as children must. But Clara sometimes pressed her ear to the parlor floor, listening for the faint creak of movement above. She imagined her mother standing on the other side of the ceiling, pressing her palm to the same spot. When spring came, the doctor declared the treatment a success. She is calm now, he said, detached as a proper mother should be. But in the quiet of her room, the mother's eyes had grown hollow, her letters untouched. She no longer cried, no longer called for anyone. And the cure, as it was recorded in the doctor's notes, was complete. Emotional excess resolved. Patient cured of love. The year Parliament finally spoke the words, child protection, aloud. The air in London seemed to shift not with relief, but with skepticism. For decades, reformers had pleaded for change. Poets, preachers, widows, even a few brave doctors. The factories had filled graves faster than pay ledgers, and still the machines turned. It was not pity that won in the end, but profit. The loss of children had become too expensive. The factory acts of the 1830s and 40s were meant to sound merciful. No child under 9 to labor, the bill proclaimed, and no work beyond 10 hours. But for every law written in Parliament, 10 loopholes were found in the mills. Birth records could be forged, certificates of age purchased for pennies. Inspectors, few and weary, relied on the very men they were meant to judge. Still, the nation congratulated itself. England, they said, had civilized its cruelty. At Thornleigh, the father read the news aloud at supper, his tone proud. We are a moral country, he declared. The idle poor will thank us. Edward, seated quietly at the end of the table, said nothing. His hands, still scarred from the mill, rested in his lap. The mother, thin and pale, stirred her soup without tasting it. She thought of the children she'd seen trudging past the gate, each dawn younger even than Edward, their faces grey with lint. The papers published illustrations to celebrate the new age of compassion, smiling boys at their looms, girls tending gentle machines under the watch of benevolent overseers. The images were lies, but they sold well. In truth, the mills simply learned to hide their smallest workers in the shadows, behind doors marked apprentices only. One afternoon, the nursemaid took Clara and Edward to town. As they passed the factory, she caught sight of a girl no older than 10 dragging a sack of coal up the ramp. Her hands were bare, her fingers raw and blackened. The nursemaid stopped. "Go on ahead," she told the children. She approached the foreman, heart pounding. "She's too young," she said. He laughed. "She's an orphan, the law doesn't count them." That night, the nursemaid wrote to the local inspector, signing only her initials. The letter was never answered. Weeks later, she was dismissed without explanation. The father claimed it was for theft, though nothing was missing. The truth was simpler. Kindness did not suit the household. The newspapers moved on, printing stories of progress and grace. But in quiet streets after dark, the sound of small footsteps could still be heard, the shuffle of children leaving mills through back doors, their bodies stooped and coughing. For every reform written into law, hundreds of little lives continued as before, silent, invisible, indispensable. History would call it improvement. The children would have called it what it truly was: survival, rebranded as mercy. And so the empire congratulated itself for its humanity, while its youngest citizens still learned to measure the worth of their bones in hours. When death came to the children of Victorian England, it did not leave quietly. It lingered in parlours and nurseries, beneath lace covers and portraits, asking to be remembered. In an age obsessed with virtue and appearance, even grief had to be presentable. And so a strange new custom took hold: a final portrait, to preserve the illusion that death was not loss but sleep. At first, it was a luxury of the wealthy. Photographers arrived in solemn black coats, carrying cameras the size of coffins. They spoke softly, as though entering a church. Curtains were drawn to soften the light. The body of the child was washed, dressed in white or Sunday best, and arranged with care, a doll tucked in one arm, a book in the other. Mothers stood beside the tiny chairs, eyes swollen but dry. "Keep still," the photographer would whisper. "A little longer, just until the shutter closes." The result was miraculous: the child captured forever in perfect composure, the illusion of breath, frozen on glass. Families displayed these portraits proudly, framed in gold, their edges inscribed with verses, not lost, but gone before. It was meant as comfort, but to many it felt like confession, the only proof that tenderness had existed at all. For poorer families, photographers offered discounts. "A memorial need not cost more than love," one advertisement promised. Mothers pawned rings, fathers borrowed from employers, just to afford a single image. In those cramped studios, children were propped on stands to hold them upright, eyelids painted to mimic wakefulness. The living siblings were told to stand beside them, smiling faintly so the family would appear whole. At Thornley, when the fever returned and claimed the youngest son, the photographer came at dusk. The father spoke of legacy. The mother could not speak at all. The little boy was dressed in his sailor suit, a rose laid in his still hands. Clara was told to hold him upright for the picture. "It's only a moment," her father said. "Be brave." She obeyed, her small arms trembling as the man adjusted the camera's lens. The flash flared like lightning. When it was done, the boy was carried away. The portrait would be hung above the mantelpiece by morning. That night, the mother crept downstairs and stood before the new photograph. The boy's eyes seemed open, his lips faintly smiling. For a moment she imagined she heard him breathing. Then the illusion broke, and silence rushed in. She pressed her hand against the frame, whispering, "You were loved," even if they never taught us how to show it. Years later, Clara would find the same photograph faded and cracked, its edges curling with age. She would remember the weight of her brother's body in her arms, the flash of light, the smell of roses, and she would understand what no book or sermon ever taught, that sometimes, in Victorian England, love could only survive by pretending to be something else. In this case, it had learned to masquerade as art. The governess of Thornley House had long been a creature of obedience. She followed the manuals, repeated the lessons, and enforced the rules with meticulous precision. Her gloves were always clean, her skirts ironed, her ledger open at every hour. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet unrest was growing, a pulse that began as a whisper and slowly became impossible to ignore. It started with small acts of defiance. A second spoonful of porridge for Edward when the governess thought no one was watching. A doll placed in a warmer corner by Clara, despite strict instructions to keep it near the window. A bedtime story stretched by a few lines longer than prescribed. These were minor infractions, invisible to the parents, but in them was the germ of something dangerous: mercy. The turning point came one February morning. Edward, shivering from the cold baths and frost through the nursery windows, struggled to thread a needle for his arithmetic assignment. His hands shook so violently that he pricked his finger. The governess, following the usual protocol, prepared to administer a light chastisement, but something inside her recoiled. She paused, her hand on the ruler. She looked at his wide eyes, pale and scared, and for the first time, saw the cost of obedience. Instead of striking, she leaned over and adjusted his posture gently, guiding his small fingers through the thread. "Steady," she murmured, her voice softer than it had ever been. Edward's eyes widened in disbelief. No punishment followed. The room seemed to hold its breath. The nursemaid watched from the corner, suspicion mixed with awe. The moment was small, but monumental. From that day forward, the governess began a subtle campaign. She allowed Clara to tuck herself and her sister in a little longer at night. She encouraged small confessions whispered to her rather than recited aloud in the dark. She stretched story time, added extra blankets, and occasionally offered a whispered word of comfort that would vanish before the parents could detect it. Each act was a rebellion, but one carried out in silence, as stealthy as a shadow moving across the nursery floor. The parents never noticed. They praised her unwavering efficiency, her strict management of the children. "She raises them properly," the father said. "A model for all governesses," the mother agreed. Yet inside, the governess carried the secret weight of quiet defiance. Every compassionate choice she made was a small act of resistance, a challenge to a system that had taught the children fear in the guise of love. At night, she recorded in her private notebook the smallest victories: a smile aloud, a tear wiped without reprimand, a story told just for warmth. Each entry was a rebellion, a testament to a growing understanding that discipline alone could never nurture the soul, and that sometimes survival meant bending the rules in the service of kindness. By the end of the winter, the children were quieter, yes, but also braver in secret. Edward hummed under his breath while working. Clara held her sister's hand without permission. The governess, smiling faintly to herself, knew it would take years for this small revolution to bloom fully. But for the first time in Thornleigh House, the possibility of love, careful, hidden, and courageous, had begun to enter the walls. By the late evening, the house had settled into a silence so complete it felt like weight pressing down from the rafters. The gas lamps had guttered low, their flames flaring briefly before dying, leaving shadows to stretch and bend across the patterned carpets. In the nursery, the children lay tucked beneath their blankets, their small bodies still from the day's lessons, punishments, and chores. Yet, even in sleep, the air carried tension, the quiet, tight coil of fear, discipline, and the constant expectation of correction. It was in this stillness that the governess found herself hovering near the beds. Her hands, folded in front of her, twitched with unspent compassion. Each day she had measured her actions, a word softened here, a touch withheld there, balancing obedience to the household's rules with the gnawing knowledge of what the children truly needed. Tonight, she allowed herself a small act of rebellion. She knelt beside Edward's cot, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "He's trying so hard," she whispered, though no one could hear. "He deserves more than this silence." Her voice was a thread in the dark, fragile but deliberate. She pressed her fingers lightly against his hand, a warmth denied to him by the household, the manuals, and the weight of centuries of instruction. Edward, half awake, murmured something indistinct before slipping fully into sleep. The governess traced the line of his small knuckles, leaving an apology there for the cold baths, for the rod, for the long hours of work, for every lesson that demanded obedience before understanding. In the corner, Clara stirred in her bed. The governess leaned closer, whispering once more. "I am sorry for all they have taken from you," she murmured, pressing a gentle hand against the girl's shoulder. Clara's fingers twitched, catching the fleeting warmth, and a small sigh escaped her lips. It was almost imperceptible, but the governess caught it, holding her breath as if afraid to break the spell. She moved through the nursery with the care of someone handling glass. Every bed, every child, received a whispered apology for the hours of isolation, the lessons taught with fear, the attention measured and rationed as though it were poison. "I cannot undo what has been done," she said softly to each of them, "but perhaps I can promise it will be different tomorrow." Outside, The wind rustled through the shutters, and the house exhaled a quiet, almost tangible sigh. Downstairs, the parents dined by candlelight, unaware of the small revolution occurring above. The nursemaid, long complicit in quiet mercies of her own, watched from the doorway, her eyes reflecting both awe and relief. She had known, all along, that the children's suffering could not remain unchecked forever. By the time the lamps finally went out, the governess had returned to her own room. She pressed her palms together, exhausted but resolved. The whispered apologies were not enough to erase the years of fear and restraint, but they were a beginning, small, almost invisible acts of grace that would, she hoped, leave their mark. And as the house fell into deeper darkness, the children dreamed not of rods, nor rules, nor cold baths, but of warmth, of hands held without expectation, of voices soft with love. For the first time, in the quiet of that winter night, they could almost believe that the world might be gentle again. By the turn of the decade, the world outside Thornley House began to shift, though the walls inside remained stubbornly unchanged. Newspapers brimmed with the news of reformers, women and men, who had dared to speak aloud about the conditions of children, about the tyranny of cold baths, rods, and endless labor. They wrote in journals, lectured in halls, and petitioned Parliament, insisting that childhood need not be measured in obedience alone. Their words were radical, and for some, dangerous. At Thornley, the father read the papers over breakfast with a tight smile. He scanned reports of the Children's Employment Commission, articles decrying long hours in factories, and the growing calls for compulsory schooling. Ridiculous, he muttered. They would have children coddled into weakness. His wife nodded, pressing a teaspoon to the thin cream in her tea. The world has grown soft, she said, though a tremor ran through her fingers. Inside the nursery, Edward and Clara were largely unaware of the debates raging beyond the gates. Their lives remained measured by the clock, dictated by the governess, and disciplined by the weight of expectation. Yet even here, the stirrings of change could be felt in whispers in the nursemaid's softened routines, in the governess's furtive acts of mercy. The reforms outside gave their small rebellions a secret legitimacy. One afternoon, a letter arrived for the governess, sent from a distant cousin who had joined a reformist society. It spoke of lectures on child welfare, visits to model schools where kindness and learning coexisted, and the shocking notion that children could be allowed to make mistakes without punishment. The governess read it thrice, her fingers trembling. She did not show it to the children, but that evening she lingered longer at story time, allowing Edward's eyes to sparkle just a little more freely, letting Clara's voice rise above her usual hushed tones. The nursemaid noticed the subtle change and smiled faintly to herself. Perhaps, she thought, the world was learning what the children already knew, that fear was not the same as respect, and that affection could exist without undermining authority. She wiped the children's hands after their lessons, leaving her touch lingering a fraction longer than necessary, daring to hope it would be remembered. Downstairs, the father dismissed the reforms as sentimental nonsense, while the mother, though outwardly silent, began to fold the children's linen with a gentler hand. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, imagining warmth where once only cold efficiency had existed. The house itself seemed to sense the change, its walls less rigid, its air just perceptibly lighter. That night, as the children lay in their beds, the governess whispered a story longer than usual, her voice soft with intent. Edward and Clara listened with wide eyes, imagining a world beyond rods, cold baths, and silence, a world in which children were allowed to laugh, to stumble, to speak, to be held. And somewhere far above the city, in halls where reformers gathered, the sound of voices demanding change drifted toward them like wind through the shutters, promising that one day, perhaps, the house itself would learn to bend. The morning was grey, cold, and damp, the kind of day that made the city streets glisten with frozen puddles and the air taste of coal smoke. Yet, in Parliament, something unusual stirred. A law passed not for property, not for profit, but for the children themselves. The first Cradle Act, as it came to be known, declared that infants and young children must be protected from the worst excesses of labor, neglect, and cruelty. It was modest, imperfect, yet revolutionary. At Thornley House, the news arrived by post, folded neatly in a wax-sealed envelope. The father, accustomed to ruling every inch of his household, frowned as he read. "They would dictate to me how to raise my children," he said aloud, tossing the letter onto the table. The mother, glancing over her teacup, said nothing, but her hands trembled ever so slightly. For the first time, the authority of law, distant, abstract, threatened the iron order she and her husband had long maintained. The governess, seated at the head of the nursery table, read the act carefully, her eyes scanning for the clauses that might affect her work. Children under the age of 10 were now officially recognized as needing reasonable care and protection. Forced labor was to be limited, exposure to extreme hardship forbidden. The words seemed simple, yet they carried the weight of upheaval. For decades, the children had been measured in obedience, their worth counted in endurance, their comfort always secondary. Now, the law suggested otherwise. That evening, the governess lingered longer with Edward and Clara. At bedtime, she tucked blankets more snugly around their small frames, allowed Edward an extra moment to adjust the pillow beneath his head, and told Clara a story that was a little longer than usual, her voice warm, full, and unconcerned with strict schedules. The children, sensing the subtle shift, whispered questions in the dark. "Will it always be like this?" Edward asked. The governess could only smile faintly. "Perhaps," she whispered back. "Perhaps soon it will be." Downstairs, the nursemaid prepared a small tray of cocoa for the children, something she had been forbidden to do by the manuals. Tonight, she poured the warm milk with a gentleness she had never dared before, thinking of the act in Parliament, thinking of the small revolution it represented. She pressed the cup into Edward's hands and brushed his hair with fingers ungloved, letting her touch linger just long enough to be felt. The father, pacing the hall above, heard the soft laughter and whispered voices and paused. He did not intervene. The first Cradle Act had not yet arrived at the doorstep of Thornley, but it had already begun to unsettle the walls. Even in a house built on tradition, fear, and obedience, the seeds of change could find purchase. By the time the candle burned low, the children slept soundly, cocooned in warmth that no rule or rod could diminish. Outside, the wind rattled against the shutters, carrying with it the distant promise of a world that might finally recognize what the house had long denied, that love, care, and protection were not indulgence, but right. The first morning after the first Cradle Act passed, the house felt different, though nothing had yet changed visibly. The children stirred in their beds with a small sense of expectation, sensing, though they did not understand, that the world beyond their walls had begun to acknowledge them as something more than objects of discipline. Upstairs, the mother lingered by the nursery door, her hands pressed to the wood, a faint tremor running through her fingers. For years, her voice had been measured, quiet, restrained by the rules of propriety and the warnings of doctors who insisted that too much maternal attention would weaken both her and her children. Yet today, she felt something shift, a fragile permission, granted not by the governess or the father, but by law itself, that she might reclaim a small piece of herself. When the nursemaid brought Edward and Clara to the nursery table, she spoke first. "Rise, children," she said, in a voice that no longer trembled. "Your mother wishes to see you." The children obeyed, hesitant at first, unsure if the invitation carried danger. Edward's hands fidgeted, and Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. The mother knelt before them, carefully, as if unsure whether her touch would be received. She took Edward's hand, feeling the strength of his small bones beneath the calloused skin, and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. "I have missed you," she said, and the words, simple, soft, unguarded, echoed through the quiet room. Clara reached forward as well, letting her mother smooth her hair. The governess watched from a distance, her ledger closed, realizing that this was not defiance, but a necessary grace. It was not a grand rebellion, no sudden overturning of years of control. It was a whisper of humanity, returning to a household that had nearly forgotten what it meant. The mother's voice, once muffled and subdued, now carried gentle instructions, comforting words, even laughter low, careful, but unmistakable. Edward smiled faintly, a small crack in the armor of discipline, and Clara's shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. The father, alerted to the change, came upstairs. He did not scold, he only observed. For the first time, he realized that the law could guide not only what was forbidden, but also what was permitted. The mother's affection did not ruin the children, it strengthened them in ways he could not yet name. Throughout the morning, the mother remained present. She sang a brief lullaby, spoke softly about the day ahead, and allowed the children to ask questions, answer them, and even touch her all acts, previously considered dangerous indulgences. The nursemaid smiled quietly, seeing her long-suppressed instinct mirrored in her employer. By afternoon, the children had begun to speak freely for the first time in years. Their voices, timid at first, grew stronger as the mother's tone encouraged honesty without fear. The walls, once rigid, with discipline, seemed to inhale and exhale along with them, carrying the sound of reclaimed warmth. That evening, as the lamps dimmed, the mother kissed each child lightly on the forehead. No rules dictated this, no fear restrained her. In the quiet glow of the nursery, the first small act of maternal freedom in years had taken place. A voice returned, soft and true, heralding the possibility of love without constraint. The day began like any other in Thornley House, with gas lamps flickering in the chill and the children moving silently through the corridors. Yet something had changed, an unspoken tension hung in the air, the sense of an era's end pressing against the walls. The governess, ledger in hand, patrolled the nursery with the same precision she had for decades, yet her steps felt heavier, her eyes less certain. Even the father, ordinarily stern and immovable, paused in the hall, reading a letter from Parliament about the new regulations limiting corporal punishment. It was Edward who nearly broke the quiet. He had been clumsy with his arithmetic slate, the chalk slipping from his fingers and scratching a long line across the polished wood table. The governess caught the slip, her hand hovering above the ruler, the first instinct of her entire life. In years past, the punishment would have been immediate, swift, and precise. Edward would have felt the bite of leather across his knuckles and learned his lesson in fear. But this morning, something restrained her. Perhaps it was the first cradle act, perhaps the subtle return of his mother's voice, perhaps the faint murmur of reform in society. Whatever it was, she hesitated. Edward looked up, sensing the pause. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the governess lowered the ruler. No strike came, no warning, only the quiet tick of the clock, and the awareness that the rules of the house had begun to shift. Clara, sitting beside her brother, stared wide-eyed. She had never seen the governess hesitate. The room felt suspended, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting to see what would happen next. Edward, understanding that the absence of pain was permission, straightened his back and continued writing. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a fragile, secret victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later, the father entered the room, expecting obedience, perhaps even a tale of punishment executed. He found only quiet industry and a governess sitting with her hands folded. He frowned, questioning her glance, but no words came. The law had changed the landscape of authority, and even he could not command what it forbade. The nursemaid watched from the doorway, her eyes wet with relief. For years, she had carried the memory of countless small bruises and tears, Edward's and Clara's alike. And now, finally, the cycle had been broken. She dared to step closer, adjusting Edward's collar and tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear. Her touch gentle, permitted by no manual, sanctioned only by necessity and heart. By evening, the children went to bed, unmarked. The candlelight flickered softly across their faces, revealing cheeks flushed with warmth instead of fear. For the first time in memory, no rod had moved, no punishment had been inflicted, and no child went to sleep with the sting of authority upon them. Outside, the wind rustled through the shutters, carrying with it the promise of something new. Within Thornley House, the last beating had been administered not with leather, but with hesitation, and in that pause, a revolution had begun. Love, compassion, and gentleness could exist alongside order, and the children, at last, could breathe in a world that no longer measured them by the rods of old. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains, painting stripes across the nursery floor. For the first time in years, Edward and Clara awoke not to the sound of rules, rods, or reprimands, but to the gentle hum of warmth and possibility. The house, once rigid with fear, seemed to exhale along with them, a long, slow sigh that carried promise in its invisible weight. Their mother entered quietly, a smile on her lips that had not been seen in many seasons. She knelt beside Edward's bed and brushed a hand across his forehead. "Good morning," she whispered. "You can breathe today." The words, so simple, felt revolutionary. The boy blinked in surprise, sensing that safety could exist without condition, that tenderness was no longer forbidden. Clara, peeking from beneath her blankets, reached for her mother's hand, letting it linger, warm and forgiving. The governess, watching from the doorway, lowered her ledger and allowed herself a small, secret smile. She had spent years measuring every action, correcting every misstep, enforcing fear as a tool of learning. But now she realized something profound. A child who breathes freely, unshackled from constant dread, learns more than obedience ever could. Discipline could coexist with compassion, and authority no longer required cruelty. Breakfast that morning was the first without tension. The children ate slowly, their hands steady, voices quiet but unforced. Laughter slipped between bites, timid, almost unsure, but unmistakable. Their mother joined them, reading aloud from a book of fables, her voice soft and playful. The stories were no longer lessons disguised as tales. They were invitations to wonder, curiosity, and joy. Edward's eyes sparkled with attention. Clara leaned close to hear every word, and the nursemaid allowed herself to relax for the first time in decades. Throughout the day, the house moved differently. Steps were lighter, voices less constrained, and the silence no longer oppressive. Windows remained open, but the wind no longer felt sharp with judgment. It carried instead the scent of coal, warmed by sunlight and small victories. Outside, the children could hear the distant clatter of carts and the faint murmur of neighbors' sounds that once belonged only to a world from which they had been isolated. In the nursery, the toys were no longer instruments of fear. Dolls with cracked faces were mended, spinning tops allowed to falter, and blocks tumbled freely across the floor. The children played for the first time without consequence, discovering motion and sound as expressions of delight, not trials of obedience. The governess, standing silently, realized that in permitting joy, she had cultivated courage, the courage to speak, to move, and to exist without guilt. As evening fell, the children climbed into bed, not trembling or hiding, but content. Their mother tucked them in and whispered blessings, no longer measured or rationed. Outside, the wind stilled, carrying with it a calm that seemed to linger in every corner of Thornley House. For Edward and Clara, for the nursemaid, for the governess, and for the mother herself, the lesson of the day was clear. Childhood, once bound by fear, had been restored. They could breathe again, and for the first time in memory, the house, too, felt alive with love unmeasured, unguarded, and utterly human.